A 15-year-old Ottawa boy charged with plotting a terrorist attack against Jewish people appeared in court today. He cannot be identified due to protections of the Youth Criminal Justice Act. It's alleged that in late October, the teen instructed someone to carry out a terrorist activity against Jewish people. And around the same time, he communicated instructions about an explosive substance. The RCMP has arrested 5 young persons on terrorism-related offences in the last 6 months, with this arrest being the 5th. The National Policing Organization is warning of a rise in violent extremism among Canadian youth and what they are calling a concerning trend in online radicalization. Barbara Perry is the director of the Centre on Hate, Bias and Extremism, and Amarnath Amarasingam is an assistant professor with Queen's University School of Religion. Amarnath, I'll start with you. A young person here in Ottawa has been arrested for 5 terrorism and explosive-related charges. They've been accused of targeting Jewish people. We're limited in what we can say publicly. We do know now, we just learned from court this afternoon, that it's a 15-year-old boy. What do you make of this case?
I mean, there's a few things that are worrisome about it. First, it's an extremely young person. It's not the first time we've seen young people involved in terrorism cases or extremism cases, of course. But the trend isn't in the right direction. Second, I think, with the flare up in the Middle East that we're seeing with Israel and Gaza, we are seeing a lot of what some scholars call, reciprocal radicalization on the side of both communities. Jewish communities are being targeted, Muslim communities are being targeted, and I think the more some of that rhetoric is ramping up, you're seeing a lot of these young people kind of pushed to the brink and responding in ways that are not healthy. And so, we're seeing kind of an uptick in that kind of violence as well.
Barbara, it's not just this 15-year-old boy in Ottawa. The RCMP are raising red flags about some other young people and terrorism. 5 have been arrested in the last 6 months alone. Are terror suspects just getting younger and younger?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, we're seeing a lot of adults still obviously engaged in this sort of activity, but I think that there is a certain vulnerability amongst youth right now. And in some respects, it's a hangover from COVID when they were spending so much time in the online spaces and continue to do so, where they are vulnerable, where they are easily manipulated by folks trying to draw them into darker and darker spaces.
Yeah, Amarnath, I want your thoughts on this too. I know you've been tracking terror suspects for a long time. Why are so many young people being drawn into these networks right now? I mean, we're talking about teenagers here. They're not even out of high school.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of them are swimming in some of the dark corners of the internet, and then when tempers flare up, people are some of these individuals will be pushed into violence, right? But the other thing to point out, I think, the RCMP's statement kind of made it seem like everyone was part of the same ideology, and they aren't, right? I think the common denominator is that they're all young people. But the Calgary arrests were largely attacking LGBTQ communities. In this case, we're seeing what looks like at least an ISIS-inspired, potentially threat against the Jewish community, and so we're seeing kind of a fractured extremism landscape, a very complicated landscape these days, with misogynistic violence, with far-right violence, with religiously motivated violence, and so young people are being drawn to these kinds of movements because they, partly because they live online, partly because of international events that are galvanizing them to do something beyond simply writing letters to your politician or posting in the online space. There's a real call sometimes to, particularly for young people, to do something about it, right, physically and through acts of resistance. And so I think you put that all together, and you're seeing kind of an uptick that the RCMP has pointed out.
Yeah, Barbara, what do you make of that? It's not just one ideology. It seems to be an explosion of various forms of extremism that we're seeing, largely fueled by social media, isn't it?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Amar's assessment is accurate there. Obviously, I think we are seeing multiple motivations here, but I think it's also important to remind viewers and listeners that it's not just in those extreme spaces that we're hearing these narratives, that we're hearing anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia in very mainstream spaces as well, from political figures, from other public figures. So I think that youth are already primed primed because of almost the normalization of hate, that when they're then approached or recruited in the online space, it makes it much easier to draw them into those conversations.
Amarnath, parents often claim they have no idea what their kids were up to, right? When they're faced with this sort of situation, they often say they didn't realize their child was being radicalized or they had slipped into extremism. What should parents look out for to prevent something like this from happening?
Well, I mean, I'm really glad the RCMP put out that statement talking about things to look out for, the dehumanization of others, the kind of hyper anti-government rhetoric, that sort of thing. That's very rare for the RCMP to put out statements like that, and I'm glad they did, because part of what's happening now is there's so much rhetoric out there, there's so much extremist rhetoric out there, but that we don't know who the talkers are and who the walkers are going to be, right? So many people are talking and saying extreme things that we don't know which one of them is going to tip over into violence potentially. And so the RCMP's point is clear in the sense that we want to make sure, particularly with very young people, that there is a prevention mechanism, that you're not going to arrest your way out of everything. You're not going to, jail these kids and get out of this problem. That if we can notice it early enough, if we can notice telltale signs early enough, there is a prevention mechanism in place. The Canadian government has spent the last decade or so building and funding NGOs and organizations across Canada, which are, with very well-trained people trying to help in the prevention space. And so I do hope that more of this kind of education takes place, because we don't, parents don't need to wait till laws are broken before they find out that their kid is up to something, or reading and doing the wrong things.
Yeah, Barbara, do you think we're a better place to deal with this now? I know, we've been talking about this for quite some time. Really, it flared up with ISIS, of course, in the Syrian civil war, and then there was a bit of a lull, at least for us in the news media. We weren't covering this as often, but is the country better equipped? Is the system better equipped to deal with this issue than it was, say, 10, 15 years ago?
Well, I think in the time that I've been working in this space, and I work primarily around right-wing extremism, there has been a dramatic change, and that's over the past 10 or 12 years or so. And I think in particular, the last 5 or 6 years, where, as Amara suggested, we are seeing more organizations being supported by the federal government and provincial governments as well, to develop programming that is intended to intervene at early stages, to provide things like critical digital literacy, which are useful not just to the youth, but also to adults and caregivers, so that they can actually use those same skills to identify, risky behavior in the online space. So I think we have come a considerable distance in the last few years, which is not to say that there's not still plenty of work left to be done.
I want to end on the Israel-Gaza conflict, because that certainly has prompted a lot of anger and frustration. We've seen that spill out into the streets of this country. Amarnath, are you fearful there will be an uptick in terrorist activity given what's going on in the Middle East?
Terrorist activity, I'm not so sure about, but I think overall communal violence, polarization, intercommunal distrust and hate speech, that sort of thing, is bound to happen. I mean, Canada is a country of diasporas in many ways. So whether you're talking about, the Hindu-Sikh issue, or the Israel-Palestine issue, or whole host of other things. Vast amounts of Canadians come from these communities. They have families back home. They have, vested interests back home. And so those tensions are going to impact communities here. Whether that tips over into, terrorism is another story, I think. And I'm optimistic that those numbers aren't going to be that high. But I do think, we're already noticing just intercommunal tensions and harm that's associated directly with what's happening overseas. And so that I think is my broader concern, is how these communities are actually going to be able to get along with each other and live beside each other going forward.
Barbara, are you fearful that world events will spill over into this country, that it could fuel some terrorist activity in this country?
Well, we've already seen a dramatic spike in hate crime. The question is, where does that line between hate crime and terrorism or extremist violence? Where is that line? Much of what we've seen has been vandalism and graffiti and name calling, that sort of thing. But we've also seen, fire bombs and Molotov cocktails and shots fired into schools. So is that hate crime or is that terrorism? So I think we're already beginning to see an escalation in violence motivated by hatred of the other. I don't know which you want to call it, how you want to label it, but the risk is there.
Just a dramatic surge in anti-Jewish hate and Islamophobia in this country since October 7th. All right, thank you both, Barbara Perry and Amarnath Amarasingam. Appreciate your time, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.